This week we study the story of the Annunciation to Mary about the pregnancy that she will have and the bearing of Jesus as the Son of God. We look at the concept of the virgin birth, which is accepted far and wide as part of this story. However, it is not contained in any recorded early Christian preaching or proclamation in Paul's epistles or in the early chapters of Luke's book of Acts. By the way, Luke did write two Gospels. The first one was called the Gospel of Luke. The second is called the book of Acts, or Acts of the Apostles. There's no evidence of it in Mark. In Matthew, Jesus is assumed to be the biological child of Joseph and Mary because he gives the lengthy dissertation of Joseph's background. In the common tradition of Matthew and Luke, there's another book that both of these stories have drawn upon, commonly called Q for Quell. There is no mention of it. Indeed, if it were not for a small portion of verse 34, since I have no husband, the entire Annunciation could foretell the natural birth of one called by God to be the anointed one. In fact, early manuscripts do not contain this phrase. They end verse 34 with, "How can this be?" So we move into this whole sense of Mary being a young woman, and the term virgin in these times did not mean biological. They had this sense of simply a young woman. So we need to look at this story in terms of the time it's in. I'm going to move to the next slide and have a picture of the upper portion of Israel, map of Nazareth. And I'm looking to see, Nazareth is just about the center of your screen. And so you can see where it is in relationship to the Sea of Galilee. It's southwest a touch and up in the mountains. It's a tiny little town. The biggest town nearby is Sepphoris, and that's probably where Joseph would work, and his father before him would have had their handy shop up in that area. So they're in the woods. They're kind of isolated from everything. And this is this tiny town. Let me show you on the next slide a map of Nazareth. And you can see the star in the center is kind of the inset that's down on the far right. And where the star is approximately where the Basilica of the Annunciation is. But if you look back on the larger map, you can see there's two blue boxes on the upper right side. The smaller blue box is Mary's well. And then down to the left side, approximately next to between the YMCA and Nazareth Village is where Mary's home was. And so we move into this question of where could the Annunciation have taken place. Different traditions express that it happened in different places. So I'm going to stay on this slide for a moment, then we'll see some more pictures of Nazareth in a minute. Mary is, by tradition, the daughter of Jacob and Hannah, also called Anna or Anne. We know of one other child, Salome, the wife of Clopas, whom John details as being present at the crucifixion. Getting water from the well would be the duty of the daughters in the household. So Mary and Salome were no exception. They would walk the few blocks to the well from their home, carry the water jugs on their home, and bring the fresh water back from the underground spring. Now, this well was not a dug well. It was a well that was fed by an underground spring, so there was continually water that was coming to this space. And it would be distinguished as living water, that is running water, as opposed to still water, which we would find in a pond that filled in. So there is a well that's filled with living water. And as a Christian person, you begin to hear those words, living water. I shall give you living water from which you will never thirst, of Jesus later on. So this is running through our minds as we look at the well in the center of town where they went to get their water. We don't know what they talked about, either with themselves or with the other young maidens who were going to the well. Maybe they were talking about a brighter future for themselves and their children and grandchildren. Maybe they were talking about prospective husbands. We don't know very much about Mary's life in Nazareth, except that she was a good and devout Jewish girl, as the young women in that time would have been very carefully guarded by their fathers in their home, and would be sure that they attended the proper services, did the proper prayers, and learned the proper aspects of their religion. So some people believe, and this is in the Protestant tradition, that Mary actually had the visitation from the angel at the well. This works both pro and con. The well with the concept of living water is a good sense and good story because of the living water image. But the drawback is that there are probably a lot of other women at the well, limiting the confidential nature of the exchange if the angel was a visible presence. Roman Catholic tradition places the Annunciation at Mary's home, which is to the southwest of the well, where privacy could be expected if she were home alone, although that also poses its own improbability. There's less allegory here, there's less poetic linkage, but it is a possibility, although she would then be alone in her home as an angelic appearance comes, and we don't know if that person came as a human being, as a man, then that would be a problem for them in that house. In any case, Mary is by now betrothed to Joseph. We know from the need for Joseph to go to Bethlehem for the census that his family is not from Nazareth. And we also know that Mary went to visit her kinswoman Elizabeth in Bethlehem area. So as Elizabeth and Zechariah lived in Hebron, a small town not too far from Bethlehem, it's quite likely Mary had visited there before, and it may even be that the families had arranged for this couple to become married. The story begins as an angel appears before Mary and greets her with the statement, "Hail, O favored one, the Lord is with you." So, moving down a slide. Let me just take you to the early Nazareth hillside. This would have been what this looked about 500 years ago, maybe in the time of Jesus as well. And here's what Nazareth looks like today. With the church in the center with the big steeple is the Church of the Annunciation. To the upper center part of the picture would be where Mary's home is. Upper right part of the picture is where the well would be located. And now we have the Annunciation. And the slides that I have depict the presence of the angel in Mary's home. I do want to note that you see that the angel is bringing something in the hand, and that is a lily. So in every good artistic representation of Mary with the Annunciation, you will find a lily present. And even when you see pictures of Mary at the cross, you will see a lily either in her hand or on the ground nearby. That is the artistic representation of Mary as pure and holy. So we're in her home at this point in this picture. "Hail, O favored one, the Lord is with you." Well, we don't exactly know how the angel appeared, whether it was an apparition such as this picture, or moving to the next one. She's sitting down on a rug and she just has a hearing, or this one where there's actually Boticelli put in the picture. There was an actual angelic presence with a halo and the wings and everything else. So we don't know which, if any of those, is accurate. We just know that this angel appeared to Mary. We don't know if she was surprised, if she was, if the angel oozed through the wall or whatever. And the King James Version simply says that when she saw him, she was troubled at his saying, and cast in her mind what manner of salutation this might be. Other later editions simply omit the first words, "when she saw him." So we don't know that he was a physical presentation, or whether it was spiritual or simply something she was hearing in her own head and in her own spirit. In this edition, the angel does not directly identify itself as it did to Zechariah, but we do know that it is Gabriel. Gabriel calls Mary favored. So what can we derive from this greeting, favored? Certainly the task she was being summoned to fulfill would not leave her feeling favored. The expectations of a normal life would be abandoned. She would have the extreme responsibility of caring for the Son of God. Now stop here a minute and think about that. If you had been Mary and were called to not only be pregnant, but to carry God's Son and bear him and raise him, what an awesome responsibility that would be for you. God's favor, however, is not found in ease and pleasure and fortune, as today's world might assume. The blessing is something deeper and more elusive. So when God calls us to stand, and sometimes we feel like we're standing alone when others around are caving into the vicissitudes of contemporary living, being favored by God may or may not be one that we would choose. But Mary responds in a very positive way. What had Mary done that she had found favor with God? We don't even know this. We only know that she was a devout Jewish girl. We don't know if she had been one of the young girls who took food to the sick or helped elders along the way in the streets. We don't know. We only know that she's probably lived a virtuous and righteous life, that she's loyal to family and friends, and maybe as a good Jewish girl, she has held in her heart the hope for the coming of Messiah. And we remember the words in the Seder every year that we are waiting for the return of the prophet to usher in the new Israel. So maybe she's waiting for that as well. The interesting thing is God doesn't usually give us the why when God calls us to a special task. God simply tells us what to do and expects that we will cooperate. And if we don't initially, and I'm speaking from personal experience, if you don't respond to God's call the first time, God will continue to nip at your heels until you see that God was right and respond and do what God is asking you to do. We also know that God doesn't always call the people that we would think God would call. Doesn't call the wealthy, usually, doesn't call those who already have positions of authority. Often God calls the meek, the mild, the underserved, the not known, the unknown people, as Bruce said this morning in his message, this being Sunday that I'm recording this, that Mary was one of the unknowns, the expendables, you might even say, that she just was not in any way a person that you would choose to bear the Son of God, but God chose her. And the line comes to me that God does not call the gifted, God gifts the called. And so God gave her this gift of being called to this particular ministry. Then it says, the Lord is with you. Well, that's nice. We do that in our liturgy. The Lord be with you and also with you, and with your spirit. A common greeting of that time and hours in religious circles. Interesting that the King James Version of the Bible includes the words, "Blessed art thou among women," which become part of the Roman Catholic recitation, Hail Mary or Ave Maria, the opening phrase in the decade of the Rosary prayers. So we would say, Hail Mary, full of grace, blessed are you among women, blessed is the fruit of your womb, Jesus. Those words are not included in the Revised Standard and in later editions, along with the angel's greeting. So interpreters through time have chosen to put things in place, and then sometimes later textual experts realize that those are glosses, which by that means adding some additional words that were not in the original text. Gabriel does say to Mary, "Fear not," a quick response as she's looking rather concerned and confused. And he reiterates, "You found favor with God." Let me pause to talk about stylized Hebrew poetry, Jewish poetry, is that things are done in poetic form, not necessarily rhyme scheme, but they'll be, come walk with me one step, let us walk on two, would be the same meaning, just simply is saying, it's reiterating what the first sentence of the first phrase means. So you'll find that a lot, particularly in the Psalms, you'll find that where there is a phrase that seems to be repeated, or you can think of it in the Palm Sunday ritual, where it appears that Jesus was a trick rider balancing on two donkeys, when in fact that was simply poetic style from the Hebrew writers. So we see that a lot. If Mary was greatly troubled at the angel's greeting, she was even more perplexed at the news he delivered her. The tense of the plan is futuristic when he says, "You will conceive." So she's not pregnant. She is not impregnated by that angel's presence at that moment. No textual indication that this angel's visitation is the moment of God's insemination. The prediction of the greatness and character, even the divine attribute of Jesus, is cast again in Hebrew poetic form. Clearly, this is more a hymn of praise and hope than an empirical log of genetic lineage, that we will look at the genetic lineage later as we look at Joseph. Mary's response to this hymn is, ironically, rather plain and lacking the enthusiasm of Gabriel's proclamation. So she's like, okay, how's this going to happen? As opposed to, my soul magnifies the Lord, which she gets to later when she's with Elizabeth. But in that moment that the angel has told her she will bear the Son of the living God, I guess her only response can be, as some of us would also say, I don't know what to say to that, she would say. So, as I mentioned, the Magnificat is not placed here, but later when she connects with Elizabeth and the baby John jumps in Elizabeth's womb, and that's when the whole response of her hymn comes to be. She somewhat naively replies then, okay, it's okay with me, whatever God wants, God gets. And one can only wonder if she truly grasps the significancy of pregnancy, birth, motherhood, and family life, much less the suffering that will be asked of her as the mother of Christ. So Gabriel, in order to prove to her that God's spiraling plan is already underway, tells Mary that Elizabeth is 6 months pregnant. Mary hadn't even asked for a sign as Zechariah had, but she's given one anyway. So the conclusion of the angel's announcement is, with God, nothing will be impossible. And that's probably a postscript that Mary didn't need to hear because she probably already believed it. Her big response is to then pack up and rush down to see her cousin Elizabeth, who was already pregnant, and to share with Elizabeth this news that the angel had told her that she was going to bear the Son of God. So I'm going to move forward to, this is the picture of the well. It's a rendition of the well, and another picture of the well. Looking down the stairs to the underground spring of living water. Moving forward again. The Basilica of the Annunciation, that is in two places here. Okay, that's the large church that's now in the center of Nazareth. And we'll skip that. Okay, so she goes down to see Elizabeth. So how do you think Gabriel presented to Mary? Do you think he came in as a full-bodied being, he or she? Do you think, because angels have no gender, and sometimes they're referred to as she, sometimes they're referred to as he, either is probably not fully correct. But how do you think that Gabriel presented? Was the angel in a physical form? Was it in a spiritual form or sort of an ethereal wisping, a cloud wisping? Could it have been that she just heard the voice and didn't see anything? Would she have feared for her life if a strange man approached her, either at the well or in her home? How would she know it was an angel? How would you know when an angel spoke to you? Do you think Mary's response is typical? What can we glean about Mary from her simple responses to the angel? Mary didn't ask for a sign. If God's angel came to you to ask you to do something, would you want a sign to be sure that it was real, to prove it was authentically from God? And if so, what sign would you want to have? Would you want a writing? These days it wouldn't be on a chalkboard. This would be a text on your laptop or on your tablet. Would you want God to simply say, this is from me, it's for real? How would you want to have a sign of what was to happen? And sometimes, perhaps, we have already had signs of things to happen, and they have been sequential signs that only in retrospect do we piece together and say, oh yeah, I've been waiting for this for a long time, or God's been waiting for this for a long time. Do you think that Mary shared the news of her visitation with the angel with her parents and her sister? And what do you think their responses may have been? Mind you, Hannah and Anne, and I need to comment here, that we talk about the virgin birth with Mary, but the Immaculate Conception is not the same thing. The Immaculate Conception refers to Mary's conception in her mother Hannah's womb. And it was declared as immaculate to say that upon that conception, any sins of the parents would not be transmitted to Mary as she became an infant and then a child and then an adult. So she was considered to be sinless in order to be the mother of the sinless Son of God. What do you think her parents would have thought about this news that she was going to bear the Son of God? One can only imagine a parent hearing that response. You must be crazy. What have you been taking? What makes you think that God would choose you? And who have you been with? Those are questions that perhaps her parents had asked. Gabriel tells Mary that the child is to be named Jesus, or Joshua, Yeshua, it would be in Hebrew. This is not a name in her family lineage or even in Joseph's. Mary would have known the custom of naming male children after the ancestors, particularly the grandfathers. So why would Mary not question the name of Jesus? That's a different name in all of the family. Jesus was a common name in ancient Israel, but why would this one be called Jesus? Why do you think Luke told this story when the other gospel writers, and even the non-canonical gospel writers, did not include it? By non-canonical, I mean others than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There are Gospels of Mary, Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Thomas, are three of the ones that still exist or have been recovered, and none of those mention this either. So why do you think Luke told it when no one else did? And if the conception of Jesus within Mary was simply the product of Joseph and Mary's marital loving, would that change your understanding or acceptance of Jesus as a divine being? Would Jesus be less or more incarnate God for you? And I need to pause and comment upon the difference between betrothal then and engagement now. Today's engagements, when a couple becomes engaged, it's that they plan to become married. The betrothal had its own ritual, and in effect, the couple became husband and wife. When they traveled, they were registered as husband and wife. If a man died, she was considered his wife to inherit the belongings, and that would go to a marriage with a new husband. So the betrothal was far more than just an engagement. And it was not at all unusual for couples, once they had been betrothed, to have a relationship with one another. They could conceivably conceive. And the only thing that had not happened yet was that they had not had the formal wedding feast, and that they didn't yet move into the family or the neighborhood of the groom's parents. So it certainly would be possible that Mary and Joseph were among the same style as other couples at that time. So the question is, if this was indeed a human conception that God had blessed, would that make a difference in how you perceive the whole story of Christmas and the presence of Jesus as the divine being, the divine Son of God? Would Jesus be more or less incarnate for you if it had happened a different way? And finally, what does this story teach us about angels? What is the purpose of Zechariah's angel, Gabriel, coming here to Mary as well? Gabriel figures prominently in the Christmas stories. He is the chief messenger, after all. He's the number one in the messenger sequence in the archangels. And so being the number one, the highest archangel, you might even read something into that and say, wow, God chose the number one to send to all these people to put this story in motion. But what does it tell you about angels? How do they appear? What do they say? How do they provide care for the person to whom they're bringing a message? What is, in fact, their purpose in the entire Christmas story? We will reconvene next week as we talk then about the angel's visitation to Joseph.